When we think of a brutal businessman, images of hostile takeovers, relentless monopolies, and inhumane labor conditions may come to mind. But brutality in business goes far beyond mere financial cunning. It involves a ruthless disregard for human life, ethical norms, and social responsibility in the pursuit of power and profit. In the historical context, this brutality often manifested in ways far more severe than modern boardroom politics. It included orchestrating famines, funding wars, exploiting colonized populations, or even causing the deaths of millions in the name of profit. This exploration delves into the life and legacy of one such figure, widely considered the most brutal businessman in history, whose empire was built not just on innovation, but on oppression, bloodshed, and a chilling detachment from human suffering. Whether viewed through the lens of capitalism gone mad or the unchecked ambition of a single man, his story forces us to ask, how much is a fortune truly worth? The foundation of every titan's empire often begins in hardship, but in some cases, it births something far darker than ambition. The man at the center of this story, be it Leopold II, whose personal rubber empire in the Congo cost millions of African lives, or an American industrialist like John D. Rockefeller, who destroyed competitors to form history's most infamous monopoly, was shaped by early conditions that rewarded cunning and dominance. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the world was undergoing radical transformation. Colonial expansion, industrial revolutions, and the rise of new markets created fertile ground for those willing to abandon morality for success. In this environment, brutality wasn't just an asset, it was a business strategy. Whether manipulating governments, exploiting weak legal systems, or weaponizing poverty, this figure understood that empathy was a liability in commerce. His rise wasn't just due to opportunity, it was driven by a philosophy that saw people as tools and suffering as a cost of doing business. The rise of this brutal businessman was not an accident. It was a calculated ascent powered by shrewd manipulation, political alliances, and an unrelenting appetite for domination. From modest beginnings, he quickly learned the power of controlling supply chains, consolidating resources, and eliminating competition, not by out-innovating, but by crushing. In the case of John D. Rockefeller, for instance, his Standard Oil Company gained dominance not merely through efficiency, but through secret railroad rebates, price wars that drove competitors to ruin, and aggressive buyouts that silenced resistance. In colonial empires, figures like Leopold II of Belgium exploited sovereign power to declare vast swathes of Africa as personal property, masking greed behind philanthropy and civilizing missions. These men didn't play by the rules, they rewrote them. Whether it was oil in America or rubber in the Congo, their strategy was simple: monopolize the resource, exploit the labor, and silence the critics. In a few years, what began as a business venture had morphed into an empire, with profits counted in billions and lives lost in millions. At the peak of his power, the brutality of this businessman extended far beyond boardrooms and into the daily lives of those under his economic control. His empire spanned continents, and with it came a system of exploitation so widespread and vicious that it became synonymous with corporate cruelty. In the Congo Free State, Leopold II's rubber regime relied on forced labor, mutilation, and terror to meet quotas. Villages were burned, families held hostage, and those who failed to produce were punished with death or dismemberment. Likewise, during the height of American industrial capitalism, tycoons forced workers, many of them children, into 16-hour shifts in unsafe factories, denying them the right to unionize or even speak out without fear of being blacklisted or violently suppressed. The common thread was clear: human dignity was a disposable commodity. Profits surged, empires expanded, and the suffering of millions was either denied, concealed, or justified as the price of progress. The world watched, often silently, as capitalism's darkest face grew stronger, wrapped in suits, smoke, and statistics. Brutality in business doesn't always take the form of violence. It can be just as deadly through contracts, courts, and capital. This figure didn't just dominate industries, he obliterated anyone who stood in his path. John D. Rockefeller, for example, weaponized pricing to annihilate rivals by temporarily slashing oil prices below cost in regions where competition dared to appear, only to raise them later once those businesses collapsed. He used espionage to gain insider knowledge, manipulated railroad companies into giving Standard Oil exclusive rebates, and employed shell companies to create the illusion of competition while maintaining absolute control. Meanwhile, colonial tycoons like Cecil Rhodes used military force and legal trickery to secure mining monopolies across southern Africa. Indigenous populations were displaced, and local leaders were bribed or overthrown if they resisted. In both cases, whether through the courtroom or the cannon, the mission was the same: create a business environment where only one name mattered. By the time governments attempted to intervene, it was often too late. His grip on the economy was total, and his influence extended into politics, press, and policy. Crushing the competition wasn't a phase, it was a cornerstone of his empire. What truly solidifies this businessman's place among the most brutal in history is how he turned human suffering, especially during wartime, into revenue streams. For some, this meant supplying weapons, uniforms, and materials to both sides of a conflict, capitalizing on chaos while appearing patriotic. For others, it meant leveraging war-torn regions to expand their commercial interests under the guise of reconstruction. In the Congo, Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, was not only used to enforce labor, but also to quash resistance with savage efficiency. The rubber boom fueled by industrial demand in Europe directly incentivized mass atrocities. Similarly, during World War I, corporations with close ties to industrial barons supplied defective equipment, inflated prices, and undermined competitors to gain exclusive government contracts. Workers were often exploited harder during wartime, with wages frozen and safety further ignored in the name of national interest. All the while, these businessmen grew richer. Their ledgers showed record profits while newspapers quietly buried the stories of mine collapses, factory fires, and battlefield deaths caused by substandard goods. In their view, war wasn't tragedy, it was opportunity. Human lives were currency, and they had the means to buy and sell at will. To understand the depths of this businessman's brutality, one must look beyond economics and into the mind of the man himself. What kind of person justifies the ruin of lives for a higher quarterly return? Historians and psychologists alike have studied such figures and often found alarming traits: ruthlessness masked by charisma, charm wielded as a weapon, and a chilling emotional detachment from the consequences of their actions. Whether it was Leopold II surveying the horrors of the Congo from his palace in Brussels, or industrial barons like Andrew Carnegie preaching philanthropy after decades of crushing labor uprisings, there was a pattern, a belief in their own moral exemption. These men often saw themselves as visionaries, misunderstood geniuses whose actions would be vindicated by history. Empathy was weakness, and power was proof of righteousness. Many exhibited traits now associated with narcissistic personality disorder or sociopathy: grandiosity, manipulation, a lack of remorse. Employees were not people. They were gears in a machine. Rivals weren't fellow businessmen. They were obstacles to be erased. The most brutal of them didn't flinch at reports of massacres or child labor. They rationalized them as necessary sacrifices. To them, the end always justified the means. Their minds were steel vaults, cold, impenetrable, and always calculating. But even the most feared empires eventually face rebellion. As the businessman's power expanded, so too did public outrage. In mining towns, rubber plantations, and steel factories, the abused began to fight back. Labor unions formed in the shadows, and strikes erupted despite the threat of violence. In America, the Ludlow Massacre in 1914 saw Rockefeller-owned coal mines hired forces open fire on striking families, killing women and children. Instead of silencing dissent, it fueled a national movement against industrial tyranny. In the Congo, missionaries and journalists exposed Leopold's atrocities through shocking reports and photographic evidence of mutilated workers. Figures like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement led international campaigns that eventually forced the Belgian government to strip Leopold of his private colony. Public opinion turned, slowly, but forcefully. Governments, under pressure from voters and reformers, introduced antitrust laws, labor protections, and human rights legislation. The Sherman Antitrust Act targeted monopolies. Global watchdogs emerged to expose corporate abuse. Yet the businessman often stayed one step ahead. With wealth came influence, and with influence came immunity. He rebranded as a philanthropist, donated libraries, built hospitals, and tried to reshape his legacy. But for the workers buried in collapsed mines, the children lost in factories, and the millions silenced by colonial chains, his redemption came far too late. The backlash was powerful, but the damage had already been carved deep into history. Even long after his death, the shadow of this businessman looms large over the world he helped shape. His business model, centralize power, eliminate competition, extract maximum value from labor, became a blueprint for global capitalism. Monopolies, once seen as tyrannical, were repackaged as efficiency. His methods were studied in business schools not as cautionary tales, but as strategies for success. Some of the corporations that emerged from his empire still exist today, wealthier than many nations, with influence stretching across media, politics, and international trade. Despite this, his legacy remains deeply contested. Statues have been torn down, biographies rewritten, and philanthropic foundations scrutinized. The same man hailed in textbooks as a captain of industry is denounced elsewhere as a tyrant. In the Congo, the scars of Leopold II's reign remain visible in the Sada country's persistent poverty and trauma. In the U.S., the memory of labor massacres and exploitative industrial practices continues to inform union movements and corporate accountability. What remains undeniable is the scale of his impact, both in wealth and in suffering. His name may be engraved on libraries and charities, but it is also whispered in the ruins of burned villages and on the lips of workers who died nameless in the dark belly of his empire. His brutality was not an accident, it was a strategy. And it worked. In the end, we are left with a disturbing question. Was his brutality an anomaly or a foundational element of modern capitalism? His success cannot be denied. He built empires, rewrote economies, and bent entire governments to his will. But his path to power was soaked in blood, betrayal, and silence. As today's corporate giants grow larger and more powerful, many echo the same tactics, outsourcing labor to poor nations, suppressing dissent, dodging regulations, and greenwashing their public image. The most brutal businessman in history may be gone, but his blueprint lives on. Every unchecked monopoly, every exploited worker, every crisis turned into corporate opportunity carries a trace of his legacy. And so we must ask, is progress worth the price if it's built on suffering? Can innovation be separated from exploitation? History doesn't always warn, it often repeats. And if we're not careful, the future may be written by the next brutal businessman, smarter, subtler, and even more dangerous than the last.